Today's episode is sponsored by Golgotha, a historical murder mystery set in the First World War trenches and based around true events. When the rumour of a murdered soldier that had been found crucified in no man's land sweeps the Allied trenches, this threatens an army-wide rebellion. One soldier from each nation's army is pulled from the ranks to join a team to investigate the crime, and what they discover will change the course of the war. In part 1 we learnt about one of the first battles that troops from Western Australia fought in during the Boer War. Well, in part 2, I'd like to take a look at one of the soldiers who was part of this group, and one who was wounded in a later battle that claimed the life of the 1st Australian's commander, Major Moore. Born in Ireland, Johnston, Burley's family moved to Melbourne, where the young man worked in a dairy farm and apprenticed as a carpenter. In the 1890s he moved to New Zealand for work, before returning home and paid for this passage by working for a travelling circus, looking after the animals. When he returned, Melbourne was proving a tough place to find work at the time. So Burley booked passage to Western Australia, and he paid for this ticket with £2 he won winning a bicycle race. Here he joined the army and was soon sailing for South Africa. Now, one reason I want to highlight Burley is that numerous accounts note he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the DCM, for outstanding gallantry at West Australia Hill. This is the second highest award for bravery in the Commonwealth after the Victoria Cross. And now for the bane of all historians. Yes, many accounts of the Boer War do mention Burley winning his DCM at West Australian Hill. But when you research the accounts of the battle, there's no mention of Burley doing anything, much less something so special that would award him the DCM. Now, this is not to say he didn't do brave things during the battle, just that he was never mentioned the way Krygger was, especially when he won a DCM because of the fight, and Krygger did not. Well, it turns out the reason for this is simple. He didn't do anything at West Australian Hill because he wasn't even there. Now, when I was doing my research, I'd obviously researched the Battle of West Australia Hill quite a lot, and I'd never heard of this Burley, and so when I discovered that a soldier had won the DCM on that hill, it just rang weird to me. I just couldn't imagine who this was or what he did because I knew the battle quite well, and it wasn't exactly a long battle. So I started to research Burley, and that's where I kept finding more amazing things. And one of these was a letter home to his brother. In this, Burley wrote, "We made a great name for ourselves at Slingersfontein. 20 of our chaps held 300 Boers at bay for a whole day and saved the camp." Now, there were 130 men in the 1st West Australian, so clearly not all of them fought on top of that hill. And by this sentence it's clear that Burley was one of those who missed the fight. And that's not to say he didn't do anything of merit. He did win the DCM after all. It's just that he didn't win it on that hill. And so I just decided I needed to find out, where did he win this medal? And as I did this, I uncovered the story of this thoroughly remarkable man. So it turns out Burley was something of a letter writer, and many of these first-hand accounts that were sent back to his family were published in Australian newspapers. One of these pointed out a remarkable incident when one day, 25 of us under Captain Parker were out patrolling and accidentally rode into a Boer laager. The West Australians had just ridden into the camp of a much larger Boer army, who poured a tremendous rifle fire on us from flank and rear. But, miraculously to relate, only 3 horses were shot, but in trying to swim the river, 16 more horses were lost. The handful of Australians had ridden into the middle of a Boer army and panicked, and when they discovered they were surrounded, rode hell for leather, and as they scattered, the surprised Boers jumped up, started shooting at them, and thoroughly missed. Not a single soldier was lost, although they did lose a few horses. Every man got back to the Australian line safely, though many of them did carry wounds, but these weren't from being shot, they were from falling off their horses. In another letter to his brother, Burley later recounted being ordered to the top of a kopje to search the surrounding countryside for movement. When he crested the hill, pulled out his field glasses and began looking around, he noticed a large puff of smoke coming from the forest below. He then wrote, "I had just time to drop flat on the ground when a shell struck close beside me, almost smothering me in dust and stones. If it had struck 10 feet farther off, it would have riddled me. But I had them. They knew the rest of us and the horses were behind the hill, so instead of going back straight to where they were, I went 100 yards to the left. And before we dare move, they threw 16 more shells my way, and none where the rest of the party were. And not a man or horse got hit. They meant to have me though, for the last shell they fired fell under my horse, but didn't explode, so that I had a fortunate escape." Basically, Burley, realising he couldn't ride back to where his men were, because that would show the Boers where they were and they'd be able to shoot at them with their cannons, he decided to ride in the opposite direction, drawing the fire and leaving the men behind him safe. And I'd like to point out, that is not why he won the DCM. Now, Burley's letters are full of day-to-day life of the men in the army, and they're quite interesting reading. He notes that they had to get up at dawn, eat cold food, fight and ride all day until nightfall, when they would make camp on the hard South African soil, get some food in them again, and get to sleep, and do it the next day and the next day and the next day. In many of them he does note close encounters, some battles that he was in, and yet none of these actually talk about the DCM. To discover how Burley won his medal, it was actually in another newspaper report where I found what had happened and how he won the second most important medal in the Commonwealth Army. Bizarrely, the first hint at what happened was in a report in the Australian newspapers about an incident that happened in South Africa during the war. These papers all talked about a bridge near Delgoa Bay that was destroyed, and the reports claimed the Boers themselves believed it had been taken down by a number of escaped prisoners. It was not for another year that we found out what actually happened, when the paper suddenly became full of Australian men winning their DCMs. It turns out Burley and two other men, Sergeant Major Edward and Private R. Corkill, won the medal for conspicuous good service when they did something quite remarkable. These men volunteered to cut the railway and telegraph communications between Pretoria and Petersburg on the night of June 4th, 1900. They snuck out, crossed the Allied and Boer lines, and managed to do so much destruction and were so successful that a week later they were tasked with doing it again. On June 13th, they were sent out to destroy a railway line between Pretoria and Delgoa Bay. Here, dressing up as Boers, the men snuck out through their own lines and again through the lines of the enemy, reached the railway line, destroyed it, and on the way discovered a number of British prisoners. Now they weren't just going to walk away, so they snuck in, helped these men escape, and then returned back through the Boer lines and the Allied lines and returned safely to their own units. It's clear the Boers were so unaware of these attacks that they blamed it on the escaped prisoners when they realised the prisoners weren't in wherever they'd left them, and they blamed them for the destruction of the bridge, not these Australian soldiers. It was for attack on the railway lines that these men won their DCMs. From everything that happened, it's clear Burley was a lucky man. Though this luck ran out when he was seriously wounded at the same action that killed Major Moore, and he was invalided back to England. Here he recovered and then was returned to Western Australia. Now I next discovered Burley when the soldier was asked to join a small detachment of Western Australian soldiers who were to represent the colony at the upcoming Federation, and Burley was actually there at the opening of the new Australian Parliament. A remarkable event, seeing at that time the Boer War was still going on and most Australian soldiers were still serving overseas. Now years later, despite being wounded in the Boer War, when the First World War began, Burley was one of the first to sign up. By now he'd begun working as a railway engineer, and in 1917 he enlisted in the AIF as a Sergeant Major in the 5th Broad Gauge Railway Operating Company, and that is a mouthful. Here he actually received a bar to his DCM. In other words, he won the medal again for conspicuous bravery when he was in Belgium. Here he was in charge of an Allied explosive train, and this was hit by enemy shell and was on fire. This threatened to ignite all the explosives in all the train carriages, and this explosion could have devastated an enormous area. Burley, however, was quick to act, and he saved the day by first uncoupling the burning carriages from the rest of the train, which he then ordered to move further up the line. He then went back and tried to put out the fire, but the explosives in the burning carriage ignited, and the entire thing exploded. And for this action, this made him the only Australian to win the DCM in South Africa and a bar in the First World War. Burley remained in action for most of the war and returned home and took up his job again as a train driver. The next time I discovered Burley was in 1931, when the government actually began prosecuting him for killing a fellow train driver. Apparently he was in charge of a train at night driving through the countryside when he either missed or ignored a stop signal and drove headlong into another oncoming train. Clearly Burley's a cool-headed guy, and rather than panic, he apparently successfully started to slow his own train. The problem is the oncoming driver panicked and he jumped out of his own train and was killed when both trains hit and one carriage came off the rails and ran straight over him. The courts found that Burley had been negligent in not stopping, but apparently not too negligent because he soon returned to work. Unfortunately, it's here that his luck runs out, because in 1939 he was moving between trains when he fell and both his feet were jammed between the cowcatcher at the front and the rails. His right foot was badly crushed and several of the toes from his left foot were completely cut off. He was taken to hospital where they tried to save his legs, but there was no chance. So he lost most of his right leg and his left foot was so damaged it too was amputated. After this accident, he then retired. Yet he appears again in the newspapers when in 1951 he was determined to see the Queen, who was visiting Australia at the time. Now this was a big event, and when he got off his train he was unable to find a cab to get to the march, which was a long distance off. Yet he was so determined to see the monarchy that he'd fought 2 wars for that the man began walking to the parade. Remember, he was missing both feet and he was nearly 80 years old. The strain of this became so much that he soon collapsed. Help, however, was quickly on hand and he recovered and lived until 1955. Burley had fought in 2 wars in 2 centuries, had won the second highest military award in the Commonwealth twice, had been almost killed a dozen times, lost his legs in a train accident, likely killed another man in another train accident, and yet when he had to be helped after collapsing on his way to see the Queen, his greatest regret was that he'd missed his chance in seeing her. I tell you, people were just a lot tougher back then. So I felt Burley's story an interesting one. Not only because he was a very interesting fellow, but most people when you look at their lives have done interesting things. But it is the point that as a historian you do have to check these things. That by reading accounts, everyone was saying he'd won the DCM for the battle at the Western Australian Hill. And that clearly turned out to be not the case at all. So if you ever need to research something, I suggest do your work. Be diligent. Don't just check one fact. Don't just check one resource. Check as many resources as you can. Think about different ways of checking things, different ways of researching, exploring, and you'll never know what you find. And I think Burley's just a perfect example of that. So I hope you enjoyed this story of the West Australian Hill and Lance Corporal John Burley. Please give the video a like, as it takes a lot to research and make these episodes, and every little bit helps. And please click the link below and check out Golgotha, my First World War trench murder mystery, and all the other books I've listed on my author's page. I hope you'll find something that you may enjoy. Otherwise, I hope you'll listen in on our next episode.